Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our panel. My name's Belinda Goldsmith. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, where I run a team of 45 staff globally and 150 freelancers writing about the underreported stories. I'm delighted today to introduce Chike Aguh, who is the CEO of EveryoneOn, a US-based non-profit that creates social and economic opportunity by connecting everyone to the internet. Since 2012, EveryoneOn's connected over 500,000 people in the US with the goal of connecting 1 million by 2020. Next, we have Brett Solomon, who's the Executive Director of Access Now, an organization that defends and extends the digital rights of users at risk around the world. And then we have Alvin Carpio. Alvin spent the last decade working on issues of social justice, human rights, and public policy. He founded the Fourth Group last year, a global community established to understand the problems caused by the Fourth Industrial Revolution and developed solutions in the form of policy, technology, and civic action. So just to set the scene, more than 3.5 billion people, that's 48% of the global population, are now using the internet, with technology transforming the way they do business, receive healthcare, and communicate. The International Telecommunications Union shows 71% of young people aged 15 to 24 are now using the internet. But we're still facing a major digital divide. 9 out of 10 youngsters not using the internet live in Africa, Asia, or the Pacific. The proportion of women using the internet is 12% lower than the proportion of men. And most of the unconnected people, that's about 2 billion, live in developing countries. And I think it's surprising to hear that 62 million people in the United States are unconnected to the internet. And these are disproportionately from low-income and minority communities. Now, the United Nations thinks internet access is a human right. The UN's Human Rights Council last year passed a non-binding resolution condemning countries that internationally disrupt citizens' internet access. But is the internet a human right? Chike.
First of all, thank you for being here and having me for this discussion. We say emphatically yes. The internet is what you need if you are going to be a fully functioning human being in any society, particularly in the developed world, but even in emerging markets. In my context of the United States, to access education, to access healthcare, to access workforce development, you must be online. Just to use one example, 90% of students in the United States receive their homework digitally. Literally, if you do not have the internet, you cannot complete your assignment for the next day's work. The same is true for job applications, for college applications. But even beyond these everyday benefits of the internet, I actually think that the internet is tied to an even more fundamental human right, which is, I would term, self-determination, the ability to say what your future is going to be economically and politically. And quite literally, there are kids in the United States of America, and I'm sure in all the countries that we come from, who, if they get that internet connection, can teach themselves to code and create the next Facebook, who can create the next dominant social movement. But again, if we don't give them the internet as that right and as that tool, they're simply not going to be able to do that. And again, the right to determine your future, I would argue, is the most fundamental right, and that right goes straight through the internet.
Brett, do you agree?
I do. I think it's a complex issue because the history of the human rights framework and the international legal framework around human rights, looks at like state practice. It looks at codification of the rights. It looks at jurisprudence and so on. And I don't think we're yet, in terms of international human rights law, at a point where you could say that access to the internet is a human right. Just to slightly correct you, the UN has not actually said that access to the internet is a human right. What they said is that the human rights framework applies equally online as it does offline. But the closest right, I think, is access to information. And I think that now, with information actually being interchangeable with the internet, you could say that access to the internet is a human right. And we have started to see that. So in 2009, the French highest court said that access to the internet was a human right. Even last week, the German German Commerce Minister said that access to fast internet is a human right. So we're starting to see movement towards access to the internet as a human right. And then to come to your point more broadly, which is that the internet is not just about information. It is about the right to healthcare. It's about the right to education, to water, to shelter, to political participation. So you could almost argue that access to the internet is not just a human right, but it is a superhuman right. And I think I just coined that term. That is definitely not in the jurisprudence, but a superhuman right in the sense that it gives you access to the whole plethora of rights.
Alvin, I think you have a slightly different view, don't you?
Yeah, so, I mean, the internet, I mean, most of you in the audience now are looking on your phones and getting information about the conference and so forth, and a lot of how we got here was done through the internet. The internet is an amazing thing, right? It has created a bunch of opportunities for people who might not have had it before. It's made public services a bit more efficient in places. But I asked our community, so we've got a community of 2,000 people worldwide, and I want to share some of what they said in answer to the question is the internet a human right? Timothy said one word, no. Alexandra, second person to comment, also said no. Natalie, the third person, also said no. But then Nathaniel had said yes, because to be disconnected puts someone at a significant disadvantage compared to those that are connected, like people in this room today. Brianna also said yes, because it gives access to education and job opportunities. And I want to share this one story as well of a mother who is a friend. Her name is Chantel. She said, my kids are very young, 6 and 7, and they don't even realize how much of their life is based around the internet. Information is just so accessible to them, they don't even know what to do without it. So when you think about the new generation, it's part and parcel of their life. On Tuesday, we were out the internet, and generally, there was not much they could do. My son couldn't do his homework, my husband couldn't do his work, and she couldn't settle down with a baby without music or online shopping. But she's not sure to call it a human right. So personally, I'm sat on the fence. I think our community is trying to figure out where we stand on it. But is the internet a great thing? Yes, but is it a right? I'm not so sure.
But are we talking here more about developed countries rather than developing countries? There's still 1 billion people in the world without power. Is the human right to power a greater human right than the human right for access to the internet? Chike.
I think, and this is something I think that Brett and I talked about either today or yesterday, human rights are not inalienable. We would not rank the right to free speech above the right to freedom of assembly. They all exist together and are equally important. Are there certain things in certain places that you should strategically do first? So in the U.S., ubiquitous power is not an issue, which allows us to have ubiquitous internet, or potentially. Whereas in a place like Nigeria, where my parents grew up, power needs to strategically come first because it enables the internet. So I would not try and create a hierarchy of need here, because all of these are inalienable to you being a human being. But what I would say is that strategically in certain places, certain things must come first, just because power enables internet and internet enables so many other things. So I think that's more contextual. But I don't think we should get tricked into this false choice of saying something is more important than someone else, when quite honestly, none of us in this room would make a choice of power over internet or vice versa.
No, I mean, I think that's probably right. You know, when you look at the humanitarian response, and there's been a number of panels here over the last couple of days on how the humanitarian world is dealing with new technology, you know, food, shelter, water, and information is the fourth right, this fourth essential that comes along with people living in crisis and conflict and so on. And I think that we also heard that, like, you know, in refugee camps, the first thing that springs up in the refugee camp is the power charging station for the mobile phone. That's the first thing that people see as a priority in the context. I mean, often in the context of, you know, refugee and displaced people. So I agree, it's hard to stratify or prioritize one right over another. But I think in the information age, information gives you access to all of those things, all of those rights. So I would say increasingly, if you were really asking me to determine what is the most important, I would actually say that access to the internet is the key right.
Okay. Alvin?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting image of one of those triangles which say what you need to do to live a decent life. You know, at the very bottom, you need food and shelter, and then you can get an education to self-actualize and achieve your true potential. And now they scribbled on the bottom of the triangle broadband or internet and data as the most important thing. I think as a means to be involved in society has become very important. particularly, for example, in politics and so forth. And I think one of the big trends globally is that we're seeing a new form of inequality being created, right? Where the fourth industrial revolution and all of these technologies we're experiencing and we're at the cusp of are changing life in completely fundamentally different ways. And actually, when you look at in North Korea, where they might not have access to good or free internet, and certain places where in rural areas in the UK, you can't even access good, fast speed internet, there is already this new growing divide and inequality which definitely needs to be addressed.
Right, right. Let's assume then that the internet is a human right. Who is responsible for ensuring that the people in that country have access to the internet? Is it the government?
I mean, I think it's a, when you think about the obligation of the state to provide their citizens with the enjoyment of that right in order to protect others from infringing upon it, the obvious response is the state is responsible for ensuring that their citizens have access to the internet. But we need to understand, and as we go into the pavilions next door, is that the internet is essentially a privatized space. So we've got this weird conflict where what is the obligation of the corporate sector to provide internet access? Of course, there's the Ruggie principles, which are protect, respect and remedy, and I think that's in place. But I don't think that the tech sector actually sees this as an obligation. It's a really interesting thing about like the last mile. Like they talk about like how do we get internet to that last group of people. I think it's actually the first mile. Like we need to be thinking about from the other perspective, and from the other perspective then you bring in civil society. They have a role and obligation. I think the state has a role and obligation, the private sector, and all of the people out in the pavilion, because the people out in the pavilion are trying to build on top of the internet, but they're not actually thinking about their role in actually expanding and extending the internet to those who don't have it.
I think I would say that responsibility might be the wrong word. I think I would focus more on the self-interest. And I think one thing that we've seen is that, at least in the States, and the reason that we've been as successful as we've been, is that we've been able to engage the self-interest of various parts of society on this question. So on the government side, who's trying to figure out how to streamline when they have limited budget dollars nowadays, the instinct is to go digital with many more services. The downside, of course, is that the people who need those services are not online. So again, for the government perspective, from an efficiency point of view, being online makes sense. From the private sector, including many of the companies who sponsored this amazing conference, they make more money when there are more eyes on the internet. Therefore, it economically should make sense that they should make some investment on the front end to get more of those people online. For civil society, who, I'll use a very clear example, in the city of Los Angeles, where they've seen a huge increase in homelessness. For any of you who have been to Los Angeles, you'll know of a place called Skid Row, which is probably one of the largest homeless settlements in the United States of America. The mayor has said, along with civil society, that we're going to wire Skid Row because many of the services that homeless people would access, transitional housing, mental health, are actually now online, and it will make sense for us, even before we give them food, to actually get them online so they can access the services that frankly get them off the street once and for all. So go ahead.
But I would say that like being reliant upon the market is a dangerous thing here, because different eyes are worth different value, and different data is worth different value to companies. So we need to make sure that there's a significant investment by the state. We have 4 billion people online and 4 billion people who are offline.
Sure.
And we can't, I'm not suggesting that you're saying that it's about solely about self-interest, but the state has to play a role in this, because if it is that superhuman right, or if it is a human right, then there is an obligation and a duty of the state to progressively realise this.
Alvin, should it be the state or private companies? Should they be taking more of a role in this?
And I think, look, for businesses, of course, who are about increasing their user base, going to places where there isn't current access to the internet is a huge opportunity. I think, though, the government needs to ensure that that internet access is neutral, that it is fair from, the founders of the internet. The vision of it being neutral and fair it should remain part of it. I think the government has some role in terms of regulating and ensuring that happens. There's some cases in India where Facebook had tried to come in, government, and people said no. And I think this goes back to the fundamental question about whether or not it is a human right. Because does that then mean that governments need to allocate a large proportion or a certain proportion of their budget to providing the infrastructure for people to have access to it, rather than thinking about housing or other human rights, like the right to education or food or power or energy? So I think in terms of budget allocation and some of the tough choices in policy, it brings some questions to government. But what I would say is what's fascinating is that in the past, we've seen the Luddites who had said no to technology and were kicking and smashing machines. The question is now, is there going to be a group of civil society who are saying, in order for us to not create new inequalities, every single person should have access to the internet? I think that's a big question for civil society as to whether or not they want to campaign for this to happen, and therefore should governments and businesses kind of agree with that.
Okay, all right. Well, what trends are you seeing against this whole idea that the internet is a human right? I think, Brett, you've got some interesting figures on this.
Well, as we've seen this sort of the growth of the internet and the penetration of the internet into particularly communities and political environments where the internet has become a threat to the perceived political stability of the state, we're seeing an increasing trend towards the shutting down of the internet, actually like a deliberate and intentional disruption of services. So at Access Now, we've been tracking internet shutdowns over the last couple of years. There's been 61 internet shutdowns this year. So I think all of us would be absolutely horrified if the internet just turned off. You can imagine the mayhem that would happen here. 61 internet shutdowns across the world. India is the #1 offender. In Kashmir, in Iraq, we've seen shutdowns. In the Cameroon, they've shut down the internet in the English-speaking part of the internet, not the French-speaking part of the internet, often to do with heightened political moments of heightened political activity, so around elections, around protests, and so on. And so we've been working together with a whole coalition, the Keep It On coalition, to draw attention to this issue. We've just had a resolution passed at the Human Rights Council, which you mentioned, that said that intentional disruptions of the internet are a violation of international law, and calling upon governments to cease and desist on this. So whilst we're thinking about connectivity, we also need to think about disconnectivity and how states are actually together with companies, are controlling the internet in order to manage the political environment.
Okay, because of course we saw that during the Arab Spring. Sure. The whole internet was shut down. We've seen it in China, right. We've seen it in Iran. How do you hold governments accountable? You get the UN resolution, but how do you hold them accountable?
So I think what happens is there are trends in every sector, and the trend towards the internet shutdown is something that had not actually even been named. So we now have a name for it. We've seen different resolutions both within the Human Rights Council, but also in the private sector. So the GSMA, the GNI have all put out statements saying that internet shutdowns are unacceptable. So the tech companies, the telcos are absolutely central to this. They don't want to see internet shutdowns. So we've been working with them, and they've been working with governments to push back and say this is now an unacceptable practice. Governments have also been reported to through the UPR process, through the Human Rights Council and others, and then all the civil society organisations are now working in advance of moments when shutdowns might take place. So we saw for the first time the head of state in Ghana said, "I will not shut down the internet ahead of the election," and that was the first time we'd seen that. So there's a turning point. So it's again a combination of government, civil society, and companies working together to try and stop this trend.
I mean, just on the question of politics and sort of governance, I guess there's kind of two trends that I'm seeing, more with local authorities and nation states ensuring that there's a huge amount of digitalization where in order to access a service, whether it be social welfare or so forth, you need to go through the internet. And so there's a big question there as to, if that's the only way to access these services, the government, question mark, should they also provide access to the internet for them to access the services? There's a big question about digital literacy and the ability to actually use these services online. So I think for governments, they really need to understand, yes, innovation is great often, but does that mean you might be leaving other people behind because they don't get the innovation? I think the second trend also is this big push for online voting, where people are saying actually online voting is a way of, reawakening democracy, getting more people to vote, get out and participate in politics. If that is the case, we also need to think about those who might not have access to internet as well on that side.
Chike, are you finding this in the States as well, that like you say on Skid Row,
Sure.
they're trying to digitalize the access to services to some people who don't have those digital skills
Sure.
or that access?
I think we talk about digital inclusion in the U.S. as kind of a three-legged stool. So obviously affordable internet service, access to an affordable high-quality device, as well as digital literacy, and all of those things need to come together. I think to go to your previous question of what keeps people from getting on those things in the first place, I'd say two things. I think one, as we see kind of the underside of the internet very recently in terms of whether it be election hacking, whether it be data theft, For people who have never been online before, that is very scary. And so literally, as we do our work across the U.S., we'd have people who say, how do I ensure that I'm not spied on? How do I ensure that my family is safe online? So those are fears that can keep people who need this from actually getting it. I'd say that was one. I'd say secondly, and again, it goes back to many, I think, actors in the private sector. If we were to look at many of the largest new technology companies, they serve people like us who have means, who have money, and they have not seen the base of the pyramid as a potential market. Therefore, they see less of a need to get those people online. So I see actually the emerging business models coming out of places like Silicon Valley as a potential hindrance. Only when we see more companies making more money by helping the poorest among us are we going to see that drive for them to say from the private sector, we need more of these people online, so frankly our bottom line improves.
Yeah, I would agree with your first point, is that the internet is now being increasingly perceived as the enemy, as opposed to being the friend. It was the place where you could express, you could communicate, you could strategize, you could do things that you were not able to do in the offline world, particularly in many of the countries that we work with in the global community. But now the internet is being also seen by some as a place of terrorism, of hate speech, of online harassment. I'm particularly thinking there's a gender aspect to this that's so important that is discussed and mentioned, because it's not just about, it's about who is accessing, and it's about what they're accessing and what they're able to access. And if the space is hostile, or it's an environment which is not friendly to you, where you're going to be spied upon, surveilled, monitored, or if you're operating in an increasingly militarized environment, then what is the inclination or the desire to access, to even if it is a right? Because that right then takes away other rights. Your right to access the internet takes away your right to privacy. It takes away your right to freedom of expression. And that's a new development. We'd always seen it as opening up rights, opening up freedom of expression, opening up your ability to access all of these things. But now we're also seeing it, I think, as a negative force. And I think that's a really serious challenge for us.
Well, we're seeing that in countries like Africa, where you've got the National Digital Identification Programme, where everyone's records are now going digital. What are the dangers of that, Alvin?
I mean, in terms of privacy and so forth, is that the question? I mean, my point on this is the internet is a choice, right? I used to work in a church, and it's some of the funniest colleagues you ever have are priests and nuns. And I remember being sat in a meeting, and one of the priests had one of those radio telephones, and he was very adamant to say, I do not want a smartphone because I do not want to give companies and governments access to my data, and I'm fine with having a phone call. I think one of those big questions is like whether or not people actually are making a decision as to whether they want to be a part of it. I mentioned a story earlier on about kids who are literally growing up with this, not really understanding the implications of every activity they do on the internet. So there's a question about whether or not civil society turns around and says, are we having a conversation about whether we want this data that we're giving up to be a part of something which I can't control. I don't think we've done that. I don't know if you've seen on your phones, it has literally pointed out every single place you've been to when you've got locations there. So, and there was another story where there was a company or a kind of charity who said, go to someone random and show them the 10th photo on your phone, and would you be happy with doing that? Some people said no because it was an invasion of their privacy, but yet we give hundreds of our photos out. So I think there's a question there about like how much we want this to be a part of our lives, but instead of just taking it as it is, as a given.
Right.
Yeah.
Going back to a point you made, Chike, outside of these pavilions here,
Sure.
there's some fantastic stuff going on, every sector, really interesting ideas, but very much focused on people like us. How do you shift it so that there are more solutions coming forward for those 2 billion people who are not connected in Africa, Asia and the Pacific?
I'd say two things. I think one, for people who are like us, how do we shift our own mindsets and realize the benefits of attacking that base of the pyramid, and frankly take on some of the really hard, knotty problems in most of our societies, transportation, healthcare, which truly have the broadest base of potential impact. I think that's number one. I think number two, it's also, frankly, how do we empower and connect more people from the community that we're talking about so that they can take part. And I'll use a very clear example. In Miami, Florida, we helped connect a young mother of 3 who was living in government-subsidized housing, and she was a cook. Amazing cook, and she wanted to start a catering company. The problem was she had no money for a storefront, And the only way that she would be able to take orders is if she was online, so that she could create a website and take those orders. And she was able to get connected, create that website, and start her business with the entire goal that she would move out of public housing, and so that her kids would not have to either. The way that we begin to get some of those companies that actually shift the business model is to actually, frankly, go to the people who need them and say, quite honestly, don't wait for someone to create this for you. Let's give you the means to create this for yourself and for your communities. So again, I think it's us being more risk-taking, and also, frankly, us not trying to be saviors for people, but rather empower them so they can do this on their own.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that over the last year or two, we've started to see a greater recognition that connectivity is development. So the traditional development community has been thinking about, healthcare and shelter and food and so on, but now has realized that connectivity is actually a key to development. So you've started to see the World Bank, the Asia Development Bank, the ITU, etc., reinvest in the possibilities of connectivity as the key way to pull people out of poverty. Connectivity as a way in which to enhance economic development. And so I think we're starting to see some structural change there again, like a reinvestment in this concept, which is awesome. My concern is it's not just about connectivity, it's about connectivity to what? Are we being connected now for these remaining 4 billion to the open, interoperable internet where there's freedom of expression, etc., and privacy, or are we being connected to the censored, monitored, surveilled, militarized internet? So the 4 billion people that are going to join are going to enter into an internet that's very different from the internet that the first 4 billion entered into. And so that's also, again, a question about global inequality and the patriarchal structures, etc., etc. But it is very important that we bring this open internet to the rest of the world. And that is both a question of market and of intergovernmental policy as well as national policy.
Alvin?
I think one kind of interesting potential for the future is, when you think about all the billions of people who don't currently have access to the internet, we could see the new flourishing of future Mark Zuckerbergs, future founders of new types of Airbnbs, and all these massive companies where the internet is the great enabler, right? And by giving these tools to a bunch of people who might not have had it before, matched up with an education system which allows them to understand how you could really make use of its potential, I think there's a lot of potential good that that can come out of this. But as I say, I think government really needs to ensure that it is used for that good rather than the opposite.
Okay, so we've started to run out of time, so if I just go back to all of you, the one-up question, is the internet a human right, and what's the main challenge to ensuring so, if that is the case? Chike.
I start where I end where I began, which is that I do believe it's a human right, and I think who's responsible? We are all responsible. And so I think the challenge is, even though one may believe this is a responsibility of the state, the tactics and strategies are multi-sector. It goes to how does the media make sure that communities know that this is an issue? How do we make sure the government creates the right policies, the private sector has the right business model, and that civil society is reaching the people who need to be reached? So again, absolutely it's a human right. It's on all of us to make sure it's available for all and for us to be as creative as possible in how we make sure that we get there.
Thank you. Brett?
Yeah, I come back to your point about choice because I think we have now got to the point, technology has moved so quickly that access to the internet is a human right. I think it's a superhuman right, but I then raise the next question about the right to connect needs a corollary right in the context of the dangers, which is the right to disconnect. Do we have a right to disconnect in the digital age? And I think without prejudice, i.e. do we have the ability to disconnect from the internet without comment from the state that we're actually trying to hide something, to avoid something, etc. And I think as we start to think into the next couple of years, what are the provisions and the obligations of the state and also of the individual to say, I want to be off the grid? Which is a very interesting thing for me to say because I spent the last 10 years advocating for people to get online. So,
Alvin?
Yeah, I still sit on the fence on this, and I think just sharing some of the thoughts from our community, it's clearly the start of a really big debate. I think that the internet is an enabler, and it enables you to access certain things which are your human rights. But whether or not it's a human right now, I'm not a human rights lawyer, but I'd currently say I'm not so sure. But if people do say it is a human right, I think there's a big question for civil society to really come in and really put pressure on governments to provide those services to people who really need it.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the panel with Chike, Brett, and with Alvin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice.